So even though I'm the church moderator, I just felt it important. It's not really officially a business meeting. Tristan and Kyle have graciously been voluntold to bring microphones around. I know nobody likes to use a mic. Yeah, I know it's a pain and you echo and you kind of feel weird, but it is kind of hard to hear everybody. And especially since a lot of us are wearing masks today, if you have questions, please raise your hand. Somebody will bring you a mic. Use the microphone during your question. That way, everybody here can hear you. And also, we are streaming this. I know at least Mary Jo and Dwight. Hi, Mary Jo and Dwight. I know at least they are watching today. I suspect we have a few more. So without the mic, they can't hear your question. And so that makes it a little bit difficult for them to follow the meeting. There's also, for those of you that are watching over the stream, if you have questions, you can type your questions in the chat, and Wayne will pass them on to the rest of us. I will, in a second, I'm going to open us in prayer. I do want to observe the fact, though, that we understand there's a lot of tension, a lot of uncertainty, maybe some frustration around, this whole situation. It's nobody's fault. We're not pointing fingers at anybody. If you would please keep in mind, as we have the town hall today, that everybody that is on the pastor search team, they're all just people, and they all just want to do the best for our body. There's no secret, hidden, cabal agenda or anything like that. They love our body, and they want to serve our body, and that's how God has arranged things to have them handle this part of our body's life. So I just want to recap something from Gavin's sermon today, just as a reminder to all of us, myself included. I'm not setting myself apart. I've wrestled with strong emotions about this whole situation too. I'll admit that. But remember, put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge of the image of its Creator. And whatever you do in word and deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. So let's try to act in unity today. I don't anticipate that we're going to have a riot break out or anything like that, but it would be nice if we could leave after this meeting and be able to say, we're unified as a body and we got our questions answered. So let me open us in prayer, and then Tom's going to get us started. Father, we acknowledge that you are in control of everything, and that nothing that happens in our body has escaped your notice, and that we're not off your radar. We're so thankful for that. We're thankful that you're aware of every heart here, every tension, every sadness that's associated with Daryl's departure, and just kind of the uncertainty that's come since then. I pray that you would help us to ask clear questions, and that you would help us to process answers. And we thank you also that you've put these people on our pastor search team. You pick these people out. They each have different strengths, and they're doing the best they can, and we're grateful for that as well. We're grateful that we know that they pray, Father, and that they have not left prayer out of this process. So please bless our meeting, Father, and we ask these things in Christ's name. Okay, Tom, your clock is ticking.
Oops. Sounds like we're on WH1, huh? Folks, when we do get together as a committee, I want you to know that CR is right. We do two things. One of the first things we do is what we call heart preparation before we get around to doing the head work, which involves what exactly are we talking about tonight. But when we do the head preparation, I want you to know that we do spend some time in prayer every single time we do that. The last meeting that we had this past week, we reflected on a couple of things, but one of them had to do with exactly what CR was referencing, and that had to do with unity. And to lead our time, I used a just a couple of verses out of Ephesians. If you studied Paul very long in his letters, it won't surprise you to know that Paul uses a very similar structure in almost every letter that he writes. There's a theological part, and then somewhere he plants a flag and he changes and begins to talk practical. You saw it today in what Gavin referenced at verse 12. Usually there'll be a therefore at the beginning of that verse. And that's the case in Ephesians as well. Right at the beginning of chapter 4, Paul says, therefore. And then he shares with us, I therefore, the prisoner for the Lord, urge you to live worthily of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility, gentleness, patience, putting up with one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Humility. First off, we don't know all the answers, okay? I know you guys know that, but let me state up front, we don't know all the answers. If the answer today is, I'm sorry, we don't know, I apologize for that. We'll try to go make sure that we get it, but we may not know the answer just yet. There may be some answers that we have to say, I'm sorry, I can't discuss that with you just yet. I hope you'll appreciate that. If we're going to do it with humility, we're going to do it with gentleness. That means just what CR was referencing as well. Attitude as well as behavior in the way that we engage one another in this discussion. Patience, the actual translation talks about bearing with one another or putting up with one another in some of those translations. And I want you to know that we have one or two maybe type A's in our committee. I suspect there's one or two more around the congregation here this morning. Usually you don't have any trouble figuring out what our opinion is. But the real chore in what we're doing as a pastor search committee is not trying to find out what my opinion is. To be fair to you, I'm not trying to find out what your opinion is. I'm trying to find out what the Lord's opinion is. I respect the fact that he can speak to each and every one of you just like he can speak to me. I expect you to share what he's sharing with you. But remember that we are going to be about keeping the unity of the Spirit. How do we do that? Paul says, therefore, do. Therefore, do. You can recognize it in his letters. What do? You live the way he talked about, with humility. We don't know all the answers. We're going to be gentle with one another, and we're going to seek unity, and we're going to guard it. Now that takes work. It's easy to find out what my opinion is. Just ask me. But it takes work to seek unity. And so that's what we're going to be about. We're not going to waste your time with a whole lot of updates. We're in the section of this where we are beginning to look at and evaluate individuals. As you know, what we've told you in the past, because this is unique this time, because Charles wants to be considered, we are considering Charles first, and that's where we are. If the answer is yes, we're going to bring you a recommendation in the future that says, this is our motion, we move that we hire Charles. If the answer is no, we're going to come to you and say, we don't think he's the man. If that's the case, we will move on to all others. So as we address some of the questions, you need to realize that when you talk about time, the answer is it depends, okay? We're hurrying as best as we can right now because we have only one candidate. If that doesn't work, we'll basically wind up starting over with multiple other candidates. But we want you to understand that we're trying to be as fair as we can be to Charles and yet be as thorough as the Lord would have us to be. So that's where we are. We're going to go ahead and address some of the questions that we have routinely picked up already at this point, and then leave the rest of the time for you to ask questions.
Just checking my watch. It is morning still, and I got a couple minutes to answer some questions for you. My name's Heather Smith. I'm part of the Pastor's Search Committee, and we kind of brainstormed, put together the questions people have been asking us, as well as the questions we've been asking among ourselves, and wanted to answer those up front so that you can have time to think on these, mull these over, and if you have different questions, we'll have time at the end for those. First of all, we just wanted to address something a little that we all have asked. Why did Charles go on sabbatical now? And I will tell you myself, I went through a range of emotions on that one, thinking, well, why did he leave us in the middle of this? No, he didn't. He is contractually eligible every 7 years to go on sabbatical. And he was supposed to do it last year, but did not. And it was discussed with the personnel and with Charles and determined that it was actually critically important for him and for his family's health to go ahead and take this now. He needed that time, and it was scheduled before Daryl's resignation. He also needed time to grieve and to love on his family with his father passing away. That was critical too. The third benefit is it gave us time as a pastor search committee to get together to start discussing how we will handle this situation, to talk with God and say, what do you want? How do we proceed? So this turned out actually as a blessing for all involved, and it's good for Charles and his family. By the way, in case you don't know or recall, he will be back around September 5th. Okay, so that's about when he'll be back around here. Now, the pastor survey, we're still collecting those. We're collecting them through today. So if you have not filled it out and turned it in, they are in paper at the very back. I want to encourage you to do that before you leave. If you're online and have not done it, there is a link. You can go on to the Mountain View website and click on it and get that in today as well. Now, what we're doing with that is, as a pastor search committee, all of the data from that will be put together, and we'll be reviewing that this Wednesday at our next meeting. It's not the end-all be-all thing. It's a thermometer, it's a measuring tool, one of the many tools that we will be using to understand what God is talking to you all about, what we should be looking for and be aware of. What are you expecting? First question. What if the pastor's survey doesn't match Charles? I mean, that's a concern, right? What if it isn't the one? Well, realize that the results of this survey is not going to match any one person. It just helps us look, and it also gives us something to tell a potential pastor what the church feels like God is saying we need. So, it's not something that will rule someone out or rule someone in. It's just one of the many tools that we'll be using. What if the pastor's search committee determines no for Charles? I know that's a fear, right? What if the church says no? What if we say no? We have talked with Charles about this. Actually, he's talked with us about this and said this is where God planted him. This is his church. This is who he loves. He wants God's will above all else. That's what we want, right? Above all else. If we say no, that we don't believe that's what God's will is, then we present it to the church at the next business meeting, and our job starts over again, looking at the position, what it is, where we should go from here, and after the right process, we will start advertising to receive resumes and potential candidates. What if the church votes no on Charles? Now, just so you know, the bylaws say that there will be a special business meeting for this when there is a vote on it. And this is after many other steps, okay? This is not just hey, next week, business meeting, we're voting on Charles. No, there will be other steps to talk with him and talk with us before then. But when it comes time for that vote, there needs to be a 75% positive vote or better that we believe and that the church has set up in the bylaws to show and reflect God's will in this matter. If the vote fails, then the pastor's search committee resumes our search effort, and as Tom said before, we start again, and we start the process again. And I should correct that. We shouldn't say if the vote fails. It's not a fail. We are searching for God's will. If the vote shows us that God's will is not for Charles to be there, then we start over again. Now, if the vote is no, who is going to be helping Charles where he's the only staff member? Who will be working up here? Because Gavin's time will be done about then. Well, the short answer for this is all of us are going to be helping. Doesn't mean we're all preaching, so don't worry about that. What it means is we are helping with all the different areas of the church, and personnel will likely look at getting an interim, just for a time, that's what it means, interim pastor for that time while we are doing the job of searching for candidates and presenting them. Okay? Now, if you're also thinking, just so you know, if he is brought in, he's still the only staff member, right? Who's going to help him with that? Same answer. All of us. We are a church body. All of us work on Awanas. All of us work on Sunday school. All of us work on the ministries, on evangelism, on youth. All of us get involved, and we need to ask and see both God and Gabriella, where we can help, what we can do. Some of you all might be wondering how many resumes we have so far. We have not begun collecting resumes. We've had a few people that are interested, but right now our focus is to know God's will for Charles and the church. What if the pastor's search committee and Mountain View votes yes on Charles? Who's taking over the youth? Go back to the previous question. Same idea. We all step up, and as time proceeds, the personnel committee will be looking at who will become and when they will join as an associate pastor or as a youth leader or in teachers like that. Okay? There is no guarantee we would immediately be in the market for that. Let me be clear. When we say yes to that, it doesn't mean all of a sudden the pastor search committee puts a thing on KSL saying job opening for the youth. We don't do it that way. There will be procedures. Be patient, be involved, ask questions, ask where you can help. And this applies the same, how would we backfill Charles' current position? Same answer. Personnel committee starts going to work, we all get involved. It may be next year before that happens. Okay? One of the last questions I'll answer here, and then we'll start opening it up, is when? When will we know a decision on Charles? Well, it's our intention to evaluate Charles fairly and to go through all the steps we would with any candidate. We want to do this the right way so that nothing is skipped, no prayer time is skipped, no fasting is skipped, no question and answer is skipped. It takes time. Some of the things that take time also are we need to put together a new financial package for him. He doesn't just shift into the position and stay the same. He will be a senior pastor if that is what God's will is. We need time to put that together. We need to make sure Charles understands what the church is expecting out of him in a new position. Just because you've worked under a position or by a position for a long period of time doesn't mean you understand everything expected of you in that new position. We want to make sure that's clear to him as well. So there needs to be some time for those assessments, for the information exchange, for the development of the financial package, and of course we need to wait for Charles to come back for some of that. So we can't do some of this. We're preparing, but we can't do some of this until mid-September and towards the end of September. And when Charles comes back, he'll do a report on his sabbatical. So expect that as well. As we progress in that, you're going to hear Mary Faith up here giving updates as to how it's going. There will be another business meeting, and we'll be letting you know how things are going. Once these things have come into place, and we're praying throughout the whole thing, and we hope you all are praying with us on this, then Pastor Search Committee will seek God's will, we'll discuss it, and we'll make a recommendation to the church on whether Charles should move forward or not in this. We will set it up at a business meeting, then we'll have a special called business meeting. Be looking at more towards the end of October for all of this to play out the way it should. Don't be impatient. It's going to happen. God's providing. So, with that, we'll have Charles Ciara come up.
Whoa,
Yeah,
that
there
was
you
good.
go.
Okay. All right. We'll open the floor to questions.
Okay.
All right.
Mike
Kyle,
Runners.
Ken, and Julia. Go ahead, Ken.
Hello? Oh, there we go. All right, so I know that I'm new to all of this and everything, but my question would be, we've talked about it in a couple of our groups, with the pastor, there's some churches that do it by committee, so is that something that is being looked at as like a pastor committee, so we have more than one pastor, as like a team, almost, in a sense? Is that something that's been talked about or thought about or approached in the pastor search committee, more than one pastor coming in to work together with Charles, if he's selected?
Not officially. It's something discussed, but right now we're following the bylaws and following what the church has decided the path we should take. So right now, we're looking at getting the main pastor in. We're not going to say what the personnel committee will recommend later or the pastor will ask for later.
And just as a point of information, we have, in the past, we've had 3 pastors on staff at the same time. Mm-hmm. So there has been a team approach in the past. It's just, we kind of attritioned all our pastors out, except for one. Okay, get it, question answered? All right, Julia?
My first question is, does it have to be a question?
Right now, this is question and answer time.
Okay. Well, it seems that we've had a number of speakers come and talk about us moving towards more in the direction of people-led ministries like with the youth and getting parents more involved with that. And Charles seems to be really on board with that. And I'm wondering if that's one of the factors that you're considering in when you're looking at him being our pastor.
You want to tackle that one?
As I understand what you're asking, Julia, is are we considering how Charles will use various people to help him as pastor?
No, I meant it seems that in the recent period we've had people come that have talked about the importance of parents being the hero of their kids and parents being involved in home discipleship of their teens. And it seems like that's how we were trying to move, which Charles has advocated. Mm-hmm. And it seems like it's not necessarily, we wouldn't necessarily need a youth pastor. And my question is, are you considering that as part of
Not directly.
calling Charles to be our chief pastor? We're not necessarily losing somebody to do the youth, because we might not need one.
Not directly. I see your point. If you didn't understand the question, we need to be clearly aware of the fact that if we select Charles as senior pastor, to some extent, that means he is no longer youth pastor, or for that matter, evangelism associate pastor. How we would reapportion duties in all of those would certainly be part of that question. When Charles comes back, I know one of the things that he wants to share with you in some forum, there will be another forum, it may be like this, it may be from the pulpit, it may be in a business meeting, or all of the above, but he will share with you some of his ideas, his vision for how to proceed. Part of that would probably include the reapportionment of duties. If we move forward with him as the Lord's man for senior pastor, then yeah, there's a whole lot of work that has to follow that. Whether or not the next person that personnel would pursue, exactly what his job duties are and whatnot, would certainly be one of those things that they would have to reevaluate from the start. Last time we chose to go youth, you'll recall, as opposed to some people were more considering worship leader. Then after we had him as youth for a while, we elected to emphasize evangelism. And that's certainly one of the areas that Charles himself is very much concerned about. So there's a whole reevaluation of how we put together the rest of the staff and which pieces of that would need to be us instead of additional paid staff member. No, we're not addressing all of those as follow-ups, but we're aware of the fact that if we pull him out here and plug him in there, that has dramatic impacts across the whole ministry. I don't know if that helps.
Kyle, do you have somebody on this side? Okay, if not, go ahead.
I have a comment, just, and it's on that vein. You know, we have a personnel committee who manages our employed staff, our hired staff. We have a nominating committee to marshal up all the volunteers. And they sometimes have sort of cross purposes, because how do we know which of those two buckets they go in? And I think as a congregation, in our congregational style, we vote on everything, but sometimes we have to be careful that these committees don't take a life of their own, because they are responsible to the church. And so those are questions that the pastors will wrestle with, we as a church need to wrestle with, and we need to get them right, because there are a lot of things that volunteers can and should do. We kind of went over this when we talked about church polity, whether or not we were an elder-led or deacon-led or whatever, and as the deacon's job is to serve. Elders are to help manage things, and we've got a lot of things that occur and need to occur. The pastors get tired, they get overworked, and so who does those things? Well, that's people in the church who are gifted in those areas. And it's not necessarily a paid position, but those are things that the church needs to know who does what. And so I think we as a congregation need to start thinking about that as we transition toward that period of time where if we have a senior pastor come into October, okay, who does what and how do we figure that out?
Kyle,
Warren?
yeah, Warren.
Yeah, the Personnel Committee is already being engaged in some of the discussions that you're talking about as far as replacement goes. But I have a question for the committee that we're addressing now. If, for instance, we pick Charles as our new senior pastor, does your committee dissolve? For instance, if we say that Charles is the new pastor and the personnel committee does the same process that you've been going through, checking the pulse of the people, finding out what is going to be the replacement for the work that Charles has been doing, are we going to have to pick another committee to do that if it's a person, or are you going to stick around as a committee?
Dissolve's probably the wrong word. It's probably more like fade out, Warren. We are unique. We are a special established committee that is here for a single purpose, and then they do go away. Our purpose is specifically designed to search for and recommend a senior pastor and install him. Install, okay? What does that involve? That involves getting him here. If we were to bring someone, we're the ones that do all the coordination on the moving expense from somewhere else. We're the ones that are gonna help him find a house in this wonderful, situation we're all in, trying to find a house around here. We're involved in all of those kinds of things that involve installing. But as far as do we then also help you find an additional staff member? No. We're going to hand that off to the personnel committee. That's their standing committee's job. Are we going to just merely go away? No, because there's this crossover, Warren, you're right, from what we've done to what you're going to do. Let me give you an example. There are basically 3 pieces that we do early on in this process that they make more sense if we're talking about someone not Charles, but you'll see what I mean in just a moment. We prepare a number of things for the individual that we would approach. We prepare a look at what does this church look like. We call it a church profile. We would be able to discuss with the individual we're talking with where this church came from, how it got to where it is right now, how large is it right now, what does the property look like, what does the membership look like, what do the expenses and the business and the financial look like. Church profile. We're also going to prepare a community profile. That's to share with that individual, what does this community look like? Within 3 miles of this church, how many families have 2 or more children? We have a good bit of that information in hand right now, already updated. Community profile. The third piece is pastor profile. That's part of what you're doing right now with the questionnaire. You're helping us prepare the position, okay? You're not telling us the man, you're talking to us about the position. And some of the other tools that we're going to use do exactly the same thing. So when we're finished, we're going to have 3 profiles that help us understand the church, the community, and what the Lord is leading our people to say the pastor should look like. Those pieces are going to help y'all as you follow on to, if we need another staff member, what does that staff member look like? So yeah, we're going to share it with you, but no, it's not directly our job.
Gabria?
So, okay, I wasn't aware. I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding you. So if you pick Charles as the head pastor, you're not going to help find an associate pastor.
That's not our specific duty, no.
Okay, so how is that going to be handled?
Through the personnel committee, they
Okay.
have procedures how they'll, and like Tom said, we have things that they will use as they search. There will be some overlap, but no, that's not ours.
Okay, and then my second question is, you mentioned a possible interim after Gavin. How long would they be here for?
Till we found the next one.
Okay.
So that could be 3 months, it could be a year. It's typically not a 3-week thing. It's a longer term.
Okay, can I just voice my opinion about that? I'm not sure if that's the best approach. I've talked to several people who would agree with me because there's just a lot of baggage with an indefinite interim. I know a lot of people don't want to get attached to a pastor that's just going to leave them. It would take a long time, takes a long time for pastors to get to know the needs of the church, and it also takes them a long time to get settled into where they would actually be helping Charles a sufficient amount. The administrative side of things is a lot more complicated than people realize, and there's just a lot that goes into that, so I'm not sure if that's the best approach for us as the church body.
So if I could fill in just a little bit there, I'm not on the committee, but I think my understanding related to that is one purpose of that interim is somebody to help Charles until we get things squared away. It's not somebody to replace Charles. It, helps with things like pulpit supply and hospital visits, because we've already acknowledged, everybody understands that Charles is pretty overworked and is the only staff member when he returns. It doesn't do a lot of good to go on sabbatical and then come back and immediately be, squashed. So yeah, that's all I needed to say.
We appreciate that, and this is one of the biggest reasons why we want everyone in prayer on this. What is the right thing? Let's go with
Yeah,
Julia,
so we've got
and
Julia and then Debbie right there.
Just a little bit of history. You may remember when Bill Clinton was elected, Hillary said, well, you get Me Too for free. And I saw another back in history where somebody was asked to be a deacon, and the wife was in possession of information that nobody else knew, and this person was disqualified from being a deacon. But of course, when he's being asked to be a deacon, the wife's sitting there, she's not going to bring it up in front of people. And I've always thought that was dumb to just interview interview the pastor or the deacon without saying to the wife, do you fully subscribe to this, and do you believe this person is qualified, or is your family organized? Is your family, is he a good father? Does he have that in line? So in what we're talking about with Charles, do you have plans to interview Melissa and to say, hey, Melissa, is there anything you think we need to know about your husband? Not necessarily asking for her to tattletale, but in a way, I'd be excited if we got Melissa too.
How do you involve the wife is essentially the question in the interview process. The answer is, the short answer is yes. One of the tools that we will use with Charles or with any subsequent candidate that we would have would be an interview process, okay? We're going to look at references. It makes more sense when you think about someone that we do not know. If, for example, when we went and got Darrell, we talked to fellow pastors in his area. We talked to his DOM. We talked to DOM's deputy of mission where he had been a pastor in other places. We talked to his administrative staff to evaluate his ability to be an administrator. We talked to people who had worked with him to evaluate how well he did as an organizer. Okay, we have the luxury in Charles's case that we have direct access for some of those interviews that we might not have with another candidate. The same thing would apply with the wife. Typically, there's 2 interviews at least. The first one would be more general. It might occur without the wife. The second one would typically be a longer interview, and it would involve the wife in some aspects of that interview. So yes, she's brought in typically at that stage. So yeah, we'll probably talk to Melissa a little bit as well.
Debbie Ward.
I think there might be some confusion on the interim terminology. I know we have talked about intentional interim, and you have said the committee has agreed not to do that. So could you kind of clarify for what an interim that would fill the pulpit would be?
Deb, I'm not quite sure what it looks like. The short answer for y'all is we're not quite sure. But you need to realize if our answer on Charles turns out to be no, whether it's from the pastor search committee or whether it's from the church, that we will then re-engage as pastor search committee. Effectively, we start over, okay? From that point forward, we'll begin by saying we're ready for resumes. We're right. We don't know how long that'll be. Typically, I would expect it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 9 months before we had an answer. So the question would be, what do we do for pulpit supply and things of those natures in that 6 to 9 months? Don't know what it would look like. We'd probably, again, talk with personnel. Personnel did all of the homework on getting Gavin here. They did almost all of that legwork themselves in getting that established before we were even established as a committee. So we're going to go back to them and say, okay, What do we do for the next 9 months? What does it look like? Your concern is certainly valid. Do we have a different guy come in to preach every week? We could do that. That doesn't help Charles at all. It's basically pulpit supply if we do that. But that would provide for the pulpit. Another approach would be to try to find someone to fill in as an interim of sorts during that period, 6, 9, however long it happened to be. All of these are considerations that happen if we say no or if the church votes no when we bring Charles forward. We'll have to figure out how to approach it from there. So interim is kind of a squishy term on what exactly it would look like.
Okay, so 2 logistical points before we go to the next question. The first is we're about halfway done. It's 12:15. We're going to try to wrap up by 12:45. I don't want to squash any discussion or questions, but please also remember that the pastor search team is available to you if you want to ask them directly. Secondly, just as a point of information, there are actually pastors that do the interim thing. That's all they do. They just travel around the country. They fill in at churches that are in situations just like ours, where for 6 or 9 months we need somebody to help us with the pulpit, to help us care for our body until we get somebody permanent installed. And those gentlemen typically are very good at what they do. So that's an option if we need it. So I think I've got Ken, and then Marty in the back, and then Rachel and Julia.
Okay. Hello? Hi. So, I know we talked a lot about if Charles isn't selected to get an interim in. And yes, obviously. But then, if he is selected for senior pastor, I know this particular pastor search committee doesn't do it. It would be more personnel. Do we have, or have we thought about having an interim youth pastor to make sure that, again, Charles isn't overworked? We've already established in other business meetings that we're asking a lot of our pastors. We went from 3 to 1 and still asking him to do all 3 jobs, and that's a lot. So is there a plan to have an interim youth?
So just because I happen to be in the position, let me take that first. So Amy and I are going to step up to handle the youth until this stuff shakes out. So the youth part is covered. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Just that not being on the personnel committee, but knowing that they're doing quite the job. They're discussing all of this already. And there are many options. We can have internships, we can have interim youth pastors, we can have families step in. It's a surprise what God's going to do. Who knows what next year will look like. Okay.
When it comes to the pastor search, not any particular pastor, but just in general, one of the things that you guys look at is that with whoever you're looking at as a pastor, do you look at how they have grown their churches in the past and how they could possibly bring that to this church to make our church grow? Because I know that over the past couple of years we've kind of dwindled down with the opening of Sojourn and then with COVID and everything. But is that one of the factors that you look at? Is what can they bring to grow our church and get involved with the community and bring in new members and new families and you know, a lot of the younger families and everything, especially to help them so they can mentor their children and mentor their families and everything. Is that one of the things that you guys take into consideration when looking for a pastor, or is that something that comes later in the process?
I'll give you the short answer, and I'm sure he's got a good one. The answer is yes. We do. We ask them a lot of questions. See where they've been, where they're going, what God has laid on their hearts.
Yeah, I would just say that probably just falls under the generic term of experience. When you evaluate any candidate, you would want to evaluate experience. This is kind of a weak analogy, but bear with me. If you picture a candidate like bear with me. Remember I said unity, bear with me. If you picture a candidate like a bouquet of tulips, okay? Experience in any one of those tulip categories could be thought of as length of the stem. If, for example, I was evaluating a candidate on his administrative capability, and I pulled out that tulip, okay? The length of the stem would tell me, how much experience he had as an administrator. Put it back in the bouquet. If I pulled out preaching ability, that would be a different tulip with a different length. And it would tell me how much preaching experience that individual had had. General experience is going to be one of those tulips. For example, in Charles' case, one of the things that is unique about him is that he has never been a senior pastor. So we're evaluating him for a position as senior pastor, and yet he's only been an associate pastor. He would be making that transition. So it wouldn't necessarily be completely fair to say how much has he grown positions in the past unless you specifically looked at the area that he worked in that church, like youth or evangelism or whatnot. But I wouldn't be able to necessarily evaluate him on like growing entire numbers in a church. Might be able to do that better on someone else. His tulip stem might look a little short in that particular area. But again, I'm not looking at one tulip. I'm looking at a bouquet when I hire this man. When I say, Lord, is this the man? He's going to have me look at the whole bouquet. Face it, none of us are perfect. We're all looking for the guy who's what? 35 years old. He's got a PhD and a doctorate in ministry. He's got 20 years experience as a senior pastor. That guy doesn't exist. Okay? It's not out there. Okay? So in any individual that we look at as a candidate, we're going to have to look at the whole bouquet. But I hope that simple analogy lets you know that we're going to be looking at a number of different tulips as we evaluate the man, And the tools that we utilize to help us do that are things such as the questionnaire that you see, or some of the other tools that we're going to use, like calling up his administrative secretary and say, how's his organizational skills? How does he do as an administrator, etc.? So there's a lot of tools to evaluate each one of the tulips, if that helps.
And you have to keep in mind, too, that there's something true of all the candidates. They all have tulips. So.
Okay, so if Charles is this beautiful bouquet, and my question has got to do with how you work with the personnel committee. There's that one spiritual gift survey that we all took, and say that you analyze all Charles's stems, and you discover that there's a couple that are short. Is it possible to say, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to hire or divvy out to the church members those particular responsibilities that either he's not as gifted in, or he doesn't like, or he doesn't feel called to do. Can we get somebody else?
Sure.
Can you guys define that and work with the personnel committee and say, hey, listen, we think that Charles would be great for this, but let's get him somebody to do this?
That's exactly what we did with the past staff, Julia. When you put together the staff, you're very much cognizant of areas where your senior pastor may be strong and areas where he may be weak, okay? Where you may be able to buy, when you pick up the next staff member, you pick up a staff member who does a nice job of supporting him in those areas. Jeff, we picked him up exclusively for what? Administrative type of things. We wanted him to grow those of us in discipleship. He was targeted because of that. One of the things we'll look at in evaluating Charles is where is he strong? And then that information is going to get passed along to personnel. When they begin to look for potentially a second staff member, they now know we've got someone strong in these areas, these characteristics, but it may be important as we look at the next staff member to try to make sure that we do something that helps in the area where he could use some strengthening. That's just common sense. Personnel will tell you, yep, that's exactly the kind of thing that they would do trying to put the staff together in the future.
All right, Marty?
Yeah, this may be a little bit of a premature question, but if Charles is not God's selection to lead this church, would he, I would hope, this is opinion on my part, that he would become part of the search committee then? Is that true?
That will be up to the personnel committee, but they will consider, they'll involve him in it. He's not going to be an official part of the committee, but they're not going to hire someone without talking to him and involving him.
Yeah, there'd be coordination, but no, I'm afraid we're the ones you're stuck with as Pastor Search.
That's us.
Tom, or the committee, are we taking the demographics of the church now, pre-pandemic, or even 2 years before the pandemic, of giving information out to people, Charles or other pastors if it's not Charles?
Yes, all three.
We're doing all
We're doing
three?
all.
Okay.
Where are we at now?
Our demographic has changed drastically.
Absolutely.
From 2 years ago to a year ago until today. So I would just wanted to make sure that that was being passed
We're
out.
using all of it.
And I don't want to step on personnel committee's toes or anything, but being in personnel the last time we done this committee that's up here is actually a subcommittee to the personnel. They work directly with them. They will be done when the pastor is filled. And if we have to have a youth pastor personnel, we'll probably do the same thing and call for another subcommittee for a youth pastor, evangelist pastor, whatever subcommittee to help them. That's how the whole processes work. They are part of them, and I guarantee you they are talking probably weekly, if not daily.
Yep.
A classic example, just so you know, we can't necessarily approach funding 3 staff members right now. Why? Because our funding doesn't look like what it did 2 years ago. Okay? One of the things that we'll have to pay particular attention to is how we put together that staff based on what our giving looks like. And our giving is different than what it was 2 years ago. So we can't just blindly, turn to immediately hiring another full-time paid staff member, because we may not be able to support that immediate full-time staff member right now. It may be 2022, it possibly could be late in 2022 before we do that, but those are all sorts of considerations that are involved in the entire process of this that we're talking about. It is a big problem, and it's kind of a unique problem because of not only COVID, but all the things that have occurred in the last year. So, yep, you're right. How do we describe this position to a candidate from Nebraska? Well, he's not oblivious. He knows that the world has changed. All we can do is we can tell him, here's what we know, here's what we used to be, it's somewhere in here. Trying to be as fair as you can be. You don't want to lie to your candidate about what your church looks like. You want him to have a fair understanding of what Mountain View looks like as best that we can tell him. So that church profile is probably going to have elements from previous and what we know now. And we'll have to just do a lot of hand waving like I'm doing to try to describe to that individual as best we can, this is what our church profile looks like. Obviously, in Charles's case, he knows as much or more about it than we do, but that's unique about this situation that we're in. If we go behind him to someone else, now we have a whole different problem. We have to basically build those 3 profiles in such a way that we can describe what the church, what the community, and what we believe the Lord is leading us to in a pastor look like to an individual who knows nothing about us at all.
Go ahead, Rachel, and then we need to get a mic over to Warren. Okay.
Yeah, so time check, we're looking at between 5 and 10 minutes in case you're getting
Okay.
angry.
So these may be our last 2 questions, so Go ahead, Rich. Hold on, turn on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Ma'am.
So has the pastor search committee, going back to the tulip analogy, have you guys considered that even though in the official capacity, Pastor Charles doesn't have the senior pastor experience, have you considered that he essentially was our senior pastor, though, while Daryl was on his emergency sabbatical?
Absolutely.
John?
Yeah.
Don't force the analogy too hard.
Yeah, along the same lines of what the difference in roles is between associate and senior pastor. One of the things you've kind of mentioned by implication is the senior pastor would have the vast majority of the preaching responsibility. What can you say right now, of whether it's legal, constitutional, whatever, what are some of the differences we're looking at between what it means to be senior pastor versus associate pastor?
Well, the most obvious ones, I would say, would be twofold, John, that come to my mind. Generally speaking, the man who's going to be the senior pastor is going to be the preaching pastor. There's going to be opportunities for other people to preach, just like Daryl allowed Charles to preach, from time to time, okay? But he's generally going to be your preaching pastor. So you probably would put a little closer look on his stem, if you will, in the preaching category because of the fact that that is a big piece of that senior pastor's job. The second thing that comes to mind is if you grow to a multi-staffed person, he's going to be the supervisor of that staff as well. If there's, two associates underneath him, or an associate and two secretaries, or whatever the case may be, he's going to be the supervisor over several individuals. So you might want to look at the stem on his tulip that tells you what sort of experiences he had in evaluating or working or supervising a multi-member staff. Those are the things that obviously come to mind. The third thing that kind of comes to mind is vision. He's probably going to be the individual that's going to share with you what the Lord has shared with him about vision. So you'd like to be able to talk with him about that, I would think, and make sure that he's got a good feel for the fact that that's likely to be a chunk of what we're looking to him to do as senior pastor. So those are the ones that come to my mind right immediately about distinguishing in that regard. In this way, the senior pastor is a generalist, whereas your associate pastors are specialists. Typically, when we talk about putting the staff together, those terms come into mind. As youth pastor, for example, that individual is more of a specialist. As worship leader, that individual is kind of more of a specialist. Okay? A lot of times we talk about helping with the work, but if we go out and just hire another specialist, that senior pastor now has more work, if that makes any sense. He's just got another specialist that he has to supervise. So one of the difficulties of helping staff work together is how you share those jobs between specialist and generalist. The senior pastor is always probably going to have more of a generalist look to his position because he has those elements that don't apply to the individuals, the associates, or kind of more specialist. If that helps, that's kind of one other aspect that kind of plays into the dynamic, I think.
This is our last question, right?
I think this is our last question. Warren?
Well, this is not necessarily just a question. First of all, I'd like to personally thank the search committee I'm just in awe of what they've put together and how they're functioning. And the second thing I'd like to say is the Personnel Committee is evaluating all this. And the Personnel Committee is not just going out and looking for a new youth pastor. What the Personnel Committee is doing is evaluating everything that this committee has talked about to find where this church needs, and the pastor, whoever that becomes, needs help, and then to supply that help for the church and the pastor. And we are working on that to the point that Jeff, who we're sponsoring, gets his salary lowered in a short time unless the Personnel Committee comes back to the church and asks them to keep it up. So we are vastly aware of the funds available and those funds that are not available, and that will be part of it. But we are not looking for any particular place or position. We're just trying to find out what God is doing and how he's working in our church. So God bless your committee and the Personnel Committee as well.
You know, we want to try to be as transparent as we can. Let me just say in closing, you know, give us a call, okay? If you've got a specific question that you don't feel comfortable asking in this forum, corner us in the hall, okay, and just ask the question or give us a call. Like I say, if it gets into concerns about private situations and what we've evaluated, we're liable to tell you, no, I'm sorry, I can't really address that. And I know you understand why that's the case. But we want you to understand that we do have a process. Every time we do this, it is unique, and this one is certainly unique in that Charles is in the mix where we did not have that before. We think we're honoring the fact that he has been here with us for 8 years. We know a lot about Charles. We love Charles as an individual, but we're also trying to be fair about how we evaluate him. He is different from evaluating an individual who has been a senior pastor for a number of years. We recognize that. We recognize that we can't just necessarily evaluate the length of stem in my analogy. But we're going to try to be as transparent with you about the process and what we're doing as we can possibly be. So don't hesitate to give us a call and ask your question, and don't hesitate to bear with us if we have to say, I don't know just yet. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, let me close this in prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we continue to ask that you would help us in this area. We really do want only that which you want, which is sometimes hard to discern. Thank you for the diligence of the folks on the Pastor Search Committee. Would you please bless them, help them to be unified among themselves, and we ask these things in Christ's name today. Amen. We are dismissed. Thank you very much for an excellent meeting.